The ranger found him standing in the clearing at 6:43 a.m. on August 14th, 2024, wearing armor that belonged to another century entirely, not costume armor, not the shiny metal playground gear you see at Renaissance festivals or in Hollywood films. This was the real thing. Battle-worn plate mail crafted by hands that had been dust for 600 years, every rivet placed with deadly purpose, every joint articulated for movement that meant the difference between life and death on medieval battlefields. Duncan MacLeod had been patrolling Glen Affric for 17 years. He'd seen hikers wearing everything from designer gear that cost more than his monthly salary to plastic ponchos held together with duct tape. He'd never seen anyone wearing 14 pounds of authentic 14th century steel plate, standing perfectly still in a clearing at dawn, staring at the sky like he'd never seen it before. The man turned when Duncan approached, and something in his movement, the way the armor moved with him, like he'd been born wearing it, made Duncan's radio call die in his throat. "Thank God," the man said, his accent thick Canadian. "I've been looking for someone, anyone, where—" He stopped, looked around the clearing with growing confusion. "This isn't right. The village was right here. The people, the tents. Where did everyone go?" Duncan had been about to ask the obvious questions. Who are you? Where did you get that armor? What are you doing in my forest at dawn? When he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The armor had no rust, not a speck, not a stain, not the faintest trace of oxidation anywhere on its surface, despite the Highland damp that could corrode steel overnight. It gleamed like it had just come from the forge, yet every dent and scratch spoke of genuine use, genuine wear, genuine battle. Real armor that couldn't exist. "What's your name, lad?" Duncan asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Callum Voss." The man lifted his hands, gauntleted hands that moved with practiced ease, to his head. "I was hiking. 3 days, that was the plan. And then the mist came down, and there were voices, and I followed them because I thought—" He stopped again, that same confusion clouding his features. "What day is it?" Duncan told him. "August 14th, 2024? The color drained from Callum's face. What little color there was, he looked like a man who hadn't seen sunlight in months, pale as cave fish, though his skin showed no signs of malnutrition or neglect. "That's impossible." His voice was steady, but his breathing had changed. Quick, shallow, the beginning of panic. "It's August 14th, 2017. I left the hostel yesterday. The fog came down yesterday." Duncan MacLeod had been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was lying. This wasn't lying. This was worse than lying. This was a man who believed every word he was saying. 7 years. Callum Voss had been missing for exactly 7 years to the day. Duncan remembered the search, one of the biggest mountain rescue operations in Highland history. Helicopters, dog teams, volunteers from across Scotland spending 2 weeks combing every glen, every crag, every possible route through terrain that had swallowed hikers before. They'd found nothing. Not his tent, not his pack, not so much as a dropped energy bar wrapper. Now here he was, standing in the same general area where he'd vanished, looking exactly as he had in the missing person photos. Same haircut, same face, same age. Wearing armor that had been forged before the Americas were mapped. "Callum," Duncan said carefully, the way you talk to someone standing on a cliff edge, "I need to call this in. People have been looking for you for a long time." "How long?" But Callum's voice suggested he already knew the answer would be impossible. 7 years, lad. 7 years to the day. The clearing went silent except for the sound of wind in the pines and water running somewhere in the distance. Glen Affric in August. The most beautiful place in Scotland according to the tourist boards. Ancient Caledonian forest, mountains that scraped the sky, air so clean it made your chest ache with the purity of it. Beautiful country to disappear in. Beautiful country to lose yourself in forever. "I was only there for weeks," Callum said. "Maybe a month. Time was hard to track, but it couldn't have been more than that." "Where?" Duncan asked. though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Callum gestured around the clearing, confusion deepening. Here, right here, there was a village, stone houses, thatched roofs, people who spoke Gaelic, but old Gaelic, the kind you hear in songs. They said it was the year of our Lord, 1347. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I thought it was some kind of historical reenactment, extremely dedicated historical reenactment. Duncan had grown up in these hills. His father had been a ranger before him, and his grandfather a ghillie before that. 3 generations of Highland men who knew every track, every shelter, every story these mountains held. There had never been a medieval village in this clearing, not in living memory, not in recorded history, not in the oldest maps or surveys. But as Callum spoke, Duncan found himself looking at the ground differently. The way the grass grew in certain patterns. The way some stones seemed too regular, too purposefully placed. The way the clearing itself felt, not empty, but emptied, like something had been here once and was gone now, leaving only the faintest impression in the land itself. The armor, Duncan said. Where did you get the armor? They gave it to me. Callum looked down at himself like he was seeing the steel for the first time. When I agreed to help with the harvest. Everyone worked, they said. Everyone contributed, even strangers who came through the mist. He started working at the buckles and straps, trying to remove the gauntlets. His movements were practiced, automatic. Not the fumbling of someone wearing unfamiliar gear, but the unconscious competence of someone who'd worn armor long enough to forget he was wearing it. They taught me, he said, as if reading Duncan's thoughts. Had to, didn't they? You don't just put this stuff on. Takes practice, takes training. The gauntlets came off, revealing hands that told their own story. Callum's fingers were calloused in specific patterns, along the edges where sword hilts rest, across the palms where reins wear grooves. Working hands, fighting hands, hands that had learned skills no 21st century Canadian backpacker should possess. Duncan keyed his radio with fingers that weren't quite steady. Base, this is Ranger 7. I need immediate backup at grid reference 262437, and I need you to contact Police Scotland. We've got a missing person return. Copy, Ranger 7. Identify the missing person. Duncan looked at Callum, who was still struggling with the complexities of removing medieval armor, while apparently not understanding why that should be complicated. Callum Voss, missing since August 14th, 2017? Static filled the radio for a long moment. Ranger 7, please confirm. Did you say 2017? Confirmed. Callum Voss, reported missing 7 years ago. He's standing right here. More static. Then, Ranger 7, are you sure you're all right? Do you need medical assistance? Duncan understood the confusion. He was having trouble believing it himself, and he was looking right at the evidence. I'm fine. Base. The missing person appears to be in good health, but we're going to need more than standard backup here. Contact Inspector McPherson directly. Tell her it's about the Voss case and tell her to bring the case file. Copy, Ranger 7. Units en route. Duncan clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to find Callum watching him with the sharp attention of someone who was starting to understand that his situation was larger than personal confusion. 7 years, Callum said. It wasn't a question this time. Hi. Your family, they never stopped looking. Your sister Sarah, she comes up from Canada every August. Walks the same routes you were supposed to take, talking to anyone who'll listen. Your parents started a foundation, missing hikers, mountain safety education. Callum sat down hard on a moss-covered stone, the armor clanking with the impact. For the first time since Duncan had found him, he looked his age. Looked like someone who just learned that everyone he'd ever known had been living with his death for 7 years. They think I'm dead. They do. Most people do. Duncan sat down across from him, grateful for the rest. The morning was warming up, but something about this clearing felt cold. Had always felt cold, he realized, thinking back on all the times he'd passed through this area over the years, cold and watched and somehow separate from the forest around it. Your case is famous up here. Biggest mystery in Highland search and rescue history. But I wasn't missing. I was right here. Callum gestured around the clearing again. There were people here, families, children. I helped with the barley harvest. I learned to use a sword. I ate their food, slept in their hall, listened to their stories. What stories? Duncan found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. Old ones? Older than the village, they said. Stories about the mist and the thin places where time runs different, about travelers who stepped through fog and found themselves in other wens. Callum's voice had taken on a different quality, the rhythm of someone reciting something memorized. They said it happened sometimes, that people would come through from other times, stay a while, then go back. Usually they went back to when they came from, but not always. Did anyone else come through while you were there? A few. There was a woman who spoke English, but Old English, like Shakespeare English. Said she was from London, but her London had wooden buildings and open sewers. And a man who kept talking about automobiles like they were magic. He was wearing clothes that looked like they were from, I don't know, maybe the 1920s? Duncan felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened to them? They left. The mist came for them the way it came for me, and they walked into it. The villagers said they'd find their way home eventually, that the mist always returned people where they belonged. Callum looked up at Duncan with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who'd supposedly been missing in time. But I don't think that's always true. I think sometimes people get lost between the winds. In the distance, Duncan could hear engines, the sound of vehicles making their way up the forestry roads toward the trailhead. Backup was coming. Police Scotland would be here soon, with their questions and their procedures and their inability to process evidence that violated the basic laws of physics. Callum, Duncan said urgently, before they get here, you need to understand something. People are going to have a hard time believing your story. They're going to look for rational explanations. They're going to think you're lying or confused or crazy. Callum nodded. I get it. If someone told me this story a month ago, I'd think they were crazy too. The armor, though, that's going to be harder to explain away. Callum looked down at the steel that encased him. In the growing daylight, it seemed to gleam with its own light. Every piece perfectly fitted, perfectly maintained, perfectly impossible. They made it for me, he said quietly. The village smith. Took weeks. I helped with the forge work. Learned how the metal flows when it's hot enough. Learned how to shape it, how to join the pieces. He ran a hand along the breastplate, tracing the subtle curves that would deflect sword points away from vital organs. This isn't decoration, this is armor made for war. But you're a Canadian backpacker, university student according to your file, philosophy major. I was. Callum's voice was distant. That feels like someone else's life now. Someone who'd never held a sword, never felt an arrow bounce off his chest, never stood in a shield wall waiting for the charge. The sound of engines was getting closer. Soon this clearing would be full of people. Police, paramedics, maybe even media if word got out fast enough. The quiet mystery of the moment would be lost in the machinery of modern investigation. Duncan had one more question, the one that had been nagging at him since the moment he'd seen Callum standing in the clearing. Why here? Why this exact spot? Callum considered this, his head tilted like he was listening to something Duncan couldn't hear. It's thin here, he said finally. The membrane between when and when. The villagers knew it. Their stories knew it. This clearing, it's been a crossing place for longer than anyone remembers. And you think it could happen again? The mist? The crossing? I think it happens all the time. Callum met Duncan's eyes. I think people disappear into time and we just assume they died in the wilderness. How many missing hikers never get found? How many vanish without a trace in places where there shouldn't be any traces to hide? Duncan didn't have an answer for that. Didn't want to have an answer for that. The first police car rounded the bend in the forestry road, followed by an ambulance and 2 more vehicles. Through the trees, Duncan could see the flash of blue lights, the purposeful movement of people who'd been called to deal with something they couldn't yet understand. Whatever happens next, Duncan said, tell them the truth. All of it. Even the parts that sound impossible. Especially the parts that sound impossible, Callum agreed, because those are the parts that matter most. Inspector Janet McPherson had been with Police Scotland for 23 years. She'd worked everything from domestic disputes to organized crime, from missing persons to murder investigations. She'd seen people lie about small things and big things, seen people tell the truth when the truth was stranger than any fiction. She'd never seen anything quite like Callum Voss. He sat in the back of the ambulance, still wearing most of his impossible armor, submitting to medical examination with the patient tolerance of someone who'd been poked and prodded by experts before. The paramedic checking his vital signs kept glancing at Janet with expressions that clearly said this was beyond his training. Blood pressure normal, heart rate normal, pupils reactive, the paramedic reported. No signs of distress, dehydration, malnutrition, or exposure, temperature normal. He appears to be in perfect health. Appears to be, Janet noted. Any sign of aging, changes consistent with 7 years? Ma'am, he looks exactly like his missing person photo. Exactly. Same haircut length, same healing bruise on his left shin from a documented fall 2 days before his disappearance. If I didn't know better, I'd say this photo was taken yesterday. Janet had been looking at that photo for 7 years. Every August 14th, she'd pulled the Voss file and reviewed it again, hoping some detail would jump out that had been missed before. Callum Voss, 24 years old, philosophy student from University of Toronto, experienced hiker who'd vanished without trace in terrain that had been searched more thoroughly than a crime scene. Now he was back, unchanged, wearing armor that predated his country by centuries. Mr. Voss, she said, approaching the ambulance, I'm Inspector McPherson. I worked your missing person case. Callum looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had in his photo, though his face remained unchanged. Inspector, I'm told I've caused quite a lot of trouble. 7 years' worth, she agreed. Your family never gave up hope? Something passed across Callum's face. Grief, guilt, something complicated and painful. How are they, my parents, my sister? Word they'll be better now. We've already called them. They're flying in from Toronto. Janet pulled out her phone, showed him the screen. Do you recognize this? It was a news article dated 6 months ago. Missing hiker's family. Mark's 6th anniversary with renewed search. The photo showed 2 older people and a young woman standing in the same clearing where Duncan had found him, holding a banner with Callum's face on it. Callum stared at the phone for a long moment, then handed it back without saying anything. They've aged, Janet said gently. Your parents, your sister, 7 years, Mr. Voss. They've lived through 7 years of not knowing what happened to you. And I've lived through... Callum stopped, shook his head. How do I explain this? How do I tell them I was living in the 14th century while they were grieving in the 21st? You start by telling me, Janet said, all of it, from the beginning. So he did. He told her about leaving the hostel in Fort Augustus on the morning of August 14, 2017, about the planned 3-day circuit through Glen Affric, a route he'd researched thoroughly and hiked parts of before, about the weather turning, the mist rolling in faster and thicker than seemed natural. I was maybe 2 hours from the car park when it happened, he said. The fog came down like a wall, not gradual, sudden. One moment I could see the path ahead, the next moment I couldn't see my own feet. Highland weather can change quickly, Janet observed. Not like this. This was something else. The fog was warm for one thing. Highland mist is always cold. And there were sounds in it, voices calling, not distressed voices, just calling, like people calling friends to come home. Janet made notes, her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned over the years that the best way to get the truth was to listen without judgment, at least initially. I followed the voices. I know that was stupid, but... Callum shrugged, the armor plates shifting with the movement. They sounded friendly, human, and I was completely lost anyway. I thought maybe it was other hikers, maybe we could help each other navigate. What did you find? Edges of the fog. I walked for what felt like hours, always hearing voices just ahead, always thinking I was about to reach them. And then suddenly I did. The mist thinned, and there was a village. He described it in detail that made Janet's pen work overtime. Stone houses with thatched roofs, a central square with a well, fields of barley and oats stretching toward hills that looked like Glen Affric but somehow different. People in homespun clothing who spoke Gaelic with accents she'd never heard, even after 23 years of Highland policing. They weren't surprised to see me, Callum continued. Strange clothes, strange accent, strange gear, none of it fazed them. They said travelers came through the mist sometimes from other times and places. They had words for it, concepts I don't think exist in modern Gaelic. What did you do? I stayed. What choice did I have? The mist was gone and I had no idea how to get back to it, and the people were kind. They gave me food, shelter, work. They taught me their language, their customs, their crafts. Including armor making? Callum touched the breastplate. Including armor making. This took weeks to complete. The smith, Domhnall, he was a master craftsman, taught me how metal behaves when it's heated, how to shape it, how to join pieces so they move together. He demonstrated, raising his arm to show how the shoulder joint articulated. This isn't costume armor. Inspector, this is functional battle equipment. For what battles? The village was always preparing. They lived in dangerous times, clan warfare, English raids, bandits in the hills. Every man knew how to fight. Every woman knew how to use a dirk if fighting came to the village itself. Janet looked at the armor with new eyes. The dents and scratches she'd noticed weren't decorative. They were impact marks, places where weapons had struck and been turned aside. You fought? I learned to fight. Sword, spear, bow. I was clumsy at first, but Domhnall said I had good instincts. Callum's voice carried the pride of someone remembering a skill hard won. We never faced serious battle while I was there, but there were skirmishes. Cattle raiders from the south, a band of broken men who thought the village looked prosperous. And you think this was the 14th century? Actually, the 14th century? They said it was the year of our Lord 1347. The Black Death was spreading through Europe, though it hadn't reached Scotland yet. King David was still alive, though barely. People talked about Edward Longshanks like he was recent history instead of ancient. Janet did quick mental math. 1347, right in the middle of the medieval period. Decades after William Wallace, decades before the final Scottish Wars of Independence ended. Mr. Voss, you understand how this sounds? I understand how it sounds. I also understand what I lived through. Callum met her eyes steadily. Test the armor, Inspector. Have experts examine it. Carbon date the metal, analyze the construction techniques, compare it to museum pieces. I think you'll find it's exactly what I claim it is. Even if the armor is authentic medieval, that doesn't prove that I lived through medieval times? No, it doesn't prove that. Nothing I can say will prove that. Callum was quiet for a moment. But ask yourself this: where have I been for 7 years? If this is all some elaborate hoax, where did I go? How did I stay hidden? How did I keep from aging? How did I acquire master-level smithing skills and medieval combat training? Those were, Janet had to admit, excellent questions. The paramedic finished his examination and stepped back, shaking his head. Inspector, I can't find anything wrong with him. Physically, he's exactly as described in his 2017 medical records. Height, weight, dental work, surgical scars, everything matches perfectly. What about psychological state? Calm, coherent, consistent in his story, no signs of delusion, dissociation, or deception that I can detect. But I'm not a psychiatrist. We'll need a full psychiatric evaluation, Janet said, and a complete medical workup. X-rays, blood work, the works. Of course, Callum agreed, though I think you'll find I'm exactly who I claim to be. The only question is when I've been. Janet closed her notebook and looked around the clearing. In full daylight, it seemed perfectly ordinary. Grass, trees, stones, the distant sound of water running over rocks. Nothing magical or mysterious or impossible about it. But something nagged at her. Some quality of light or shadow or atmosphere that made her skin prickle, made her want to keep looking over her shoulder. Mr. Voss, one more question. Why did you come back? What made the mist return? Callum considered this for a long moment. His head tilted like he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. I think, he said finally, it was always going to bring me back today. August 14th, 2024. 7 years to the day. The villagers talked about the patterns, the way time flows in circles rather than straight lines. They said some people were meant to cross for a season, learn what they needed to learn, then return to their own when. And what did you learn? That time isn't what we think it is, that the past isn't gone, it's just separated from us by something thinner than we imagine, and that sometimes in certain places, under certain conditions, that separation breaks down. He gestured around the clearing. This place is one of those places, Inspector. It always has been, and I don't think I'm the first person to discover that, or the last. As if summoned by his words, Duncan MacLeod appeared at Janet's elbow, his face grim. Inspector, you need to see this. He led them to the edge of the clearing, where the grass gave way to bare earth near the tree line. There, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were marks in the soil. Footprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed into earth that had been soft when the prints were made but was now hard as stone. They led from the forest to the center of the clearing and back again, over and over, as if many people had walked the same path repeatedly over a long period of time. But that wasn't what made Janet's blood run cold. The footprints were old, ancient, worn into the earth over decades or centuries of use, and many of them showed the distinctive tread patterns of modern hiking boots. Dear God, she whispered. Aye, Duncan agreed. I've been patrolling this area for 17 years and I've never noticed these before, but now that I'm looking... How many people have gone missing in Glen Affric over the years? Janet asked. Duncan pulled out a worn notebook, flipped through pages covered in his careful handwriting. Since I've been keeping track, 14. All experienced hikers, all with proper equipment, all vanished without trace. Janet looked at the footprints again, tried to count the different boot patterns pressed into the ancient earth. Gave up when she reached 20. Mr. Voss, she said quietly, I don't think you were the first. Callum nodded like he'd been expecting this. The villagers talked about others, travelers who came through the mist. Most went back eventually, but some... He trailed off. Some what? Some chose to stay. Found lives there they preferred to the lives they'd left. Time moves differently there, Inspector. A year here might be a decade there, or the reverse. Some people found that appealing. And some people might get lost between times, Duncan added, remembering their earlier conversation, slip through the cracks and never find their way home to any when. The three of them stood in the clearing surrounded by evidence of impossible journeys, and Janet felt the world shift slightly under her feet. Not physically, something deeper than that. A fundamental assumption about the nature of reality cracking just enough to let impossibility seep through. Her radio crackled to life, dragging her back to the practical present. Inspector McPherson, this is Constable Murray. We've got media arriving at the road barrier. Word's gotten out about the Voss return. How do you want us to handle this? Janet looked at Callum, still wearing his impossible armor, sitting in an ambulance in a clearing that might be a gateway through time. Set up a wider perimeter, she said into the radio. No media access to the scene until further notice. And contact headquarters. Tell them we're going to need specialist support on this one. What kind of specialist, ma'am? Janet looked at the footprints, the armor, the man who claimed to have lived 7 years in a day. I honestly don't know, she said.